Hello everyone, this is Jason DeCristofaro, your instructor for MUS112 Intro to Jazz. In today's video I'm going to be talking about the 6 elements of music, and it's important to remember that when we talk about music there is an objective lens, which are just the facts as they exist. For example, this note is an E flat. No one's going to argue with that. You might say, I don't particularly care for that note when it comes after this note, and that would be a subjective opinion. So it's important to remember the difference between the objective and subjective analysis in music. In objectively studying music, looking at the hard, cold facts, there are 6 elements we want to think about throughout the course of the semester. These are, respectively, melody, rhythm, harmony, timbre. You'll notice that it's spelled timbre in your module, but it's actually pronounced timbre, dynamics, and articulation. There's a table at the end of Module 1 that provides an in-depth description of each of these different elements, but I'm using this video to sort of shed light in a more direct way how these elements interact with a piece of music. And as I mentioned in the module, jazz musicians throughout history will often play the same repertoire or collection of songs known as standards and interpret them in different ways. A big part of jazz music is how the jazz performer interprets something that's already been recorded, performed, or written down. And this is one of the reasons that jazz musicians will still play songs that may be 100 years old, but be finding new ways to approach these different songs. So to start with the most basic element that a jazz musician might use out of the 6 elements, we'll start with melody. And we've already seen with Over the Rainbow, very famous jazz standard by Harold Arlen, that the melody is what determines the form of the music. I'm just going to go ahead with my right hand and play the melody in its most basic form. Now that's the melody exactly as it's written. There's no alterations to it. Now, a jazz musician will very rarely play the melody the way I just did, which is totally straight with no embellishments, no variety. But a jazz musician might add additional notes to the original melody to spice it up. Here's one example. Now that's just one example, and you heard how there were a lot more notes in that melodic version. A jazz musician might also play with the rhythm. So you might remember that the original rhythm was well, a jazz musician might change that rhythm. So if you're tapping your foot along to the original written or notated rhythm of the melody, it might sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 3, 1, 2, and 3, 4. Pretty straightforward. But a jazz musician might change the rhythm of the melody. Notice how the underlying pulse or beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, spells out one measure of music. And that repeats over and over again. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So on and so forth. But I'm going to take that original melody and slightly change the rhythm. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you may have noticed that a lot of the notes in the melody were off the beat. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Notice how those first two notes were off the beat. That's something in jazz called syncopation, which we'll study a little more in Module 2. Notice also how the rhythm swings. Instead of da 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 da, it's da 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 da. So it has a swing feel to it. So we talked about how you can play with the melody and how you can play with the rhythm. But one of the biggest things in jazz is harmony, which is simply the combination of 2 or 3 or more notes to build a chord. Now a chord often exists for the purpose of supporting the underlying melody. In the case of Over the Rainbow, the written chords are as follows. Now by themselves, they really don't make that much sense. But if I put in the context of the chords supporting the melody, you'll hear how those chords I just played support the main melody. Now those are the chords that are written on the page. Just like I can play with melodic variations and rhythmic variations, I can also have harmonic variations. I can alter the chords underneath the melody to give the melody a new sound. Very different sound that time. A little more dissonant in that it had a lot more tension. Notice how dissonant, for example, this chord sounds. Out of context by itself, it may just sound like a dissonant chord. But if I do it in relation to the melody, it plays a part in a much bigger picture. Now, timbre is probably one of the easier concepts to grasp when it comes to understanding the elements of music. Simply put, timbre is a different sound. So it's the difference between, say, a flute and a drum, or a trumpet and a piano. And this does have an impact on what we hear. For instance, here's the melody to Over the Rainbow on the piano. And now I'm going to play the melody on the glockenspiel, or bells here. And you'll notice how it's the same melody, but a very different sound. As we study jazz over the course of the 20th and even 21st century, we'll see how the evolution and acceptance of different instruments with different timbres help jazz to evolve in new ways. Now, dynamics is another big thing in music, and this is also fairly easy to hear because dynamics is just a fancy way of describing volume in music, how loud or soft something is. Now, in the course of that one phrase, I started soft, then got very loud, and then started soft again, but did a crescendo back to the top note. Crescendo meaning getting louder. So dynamics play a big role in the music, and especially when we look at bigger ensembles like big bands in the swing era, we'll see how dynamics often play a big role. Finally, we come to articulation. It's important to remember that in anything we hear, it's not just what we hear, but how we hear it. And the individual who produces what we hear, it matters just as much what they create as how they create. Often jazz musicians will say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And in this sense, we have articulation in music. You'll notice that there's three musical terms for articulation: staccato, legato, and slurred. Staccato simply means a short articulation. Legato means connected or a longer sound. So if I were to play the first few notes of Over the Rainbow, staccato, it would sound like this. Very different effect than legato, where the notes are long and connected. Now, slurred refers to when one note leads into the next. For example, as we go through the semester, be thinking about these 6 musical elements and how they're impacting the music you hear. Very often, what we feel when we hear a piece of music, what we think when we hear a piece of music, and how we perceive the piece of music we are listening to is impacted by these 6 elements.